Well, if you've been with us, you know that we've been slowly trekking with Paul through his missionary journeys, and we are on the third one. It's kind of rolling to an end. Actually, he's almost done with the third one for
We're
what
going
happens
at about the
tonight.
same rate as Paul was going on his journeys.
It feels like it, doesn't it? Oh man. So I'm going to give you just a little intro in case you're like me and you don't remember from week to week, or maybe you're relatively new and you're just kind of like dropping into Acts 23. You want to make sure that you don't feel like you just parachuted in and you have no idea what's going on. So Paul is actually back in Jerusalem. So he's kind of made full circle here. And he ends up in Jerusalem being arrested by a Roman commander. And when the commander finds out that Paul is a Roman citizen, he's like, whoa, he realizes he has to treat him with certain respect levels, like he can't be flogged and he can't be thrown into prison without a trial and things like that. So the commander has no luck in figuring out exactly why Paul is in such big trouble with the Jews. They're rioting. It's a big mob scene. He's trying to talk to them. It goes real badly. They have to keep rescuing Paul so he's not killed by these people. So he finally gets a Sanhedrin together. And we said last week, we think he did that probably not in their normal chambers, but in Fort Antonia that was right there on the premises of the Temple Mount. And he puts Paul in front of the Sanhedrin, their own, his own Jewish body of governance here. And Paul gets into trouble again, sort of, because he ends up by saying, I am here on trial because I believe in the resurrection. And immediately the Pharisees are like, we buy that. That's good for us. And the Sadducees, the other half of them, just lose it because they don't believe in the resurrection. So instead of now putting Paul on trial, they're all fighting amongst themselves, and they have to take Paul out again because they're afraid they're going to rip him to shreds. And that's kind of where we ended last week. We don't always end in the most perfect locations because I would have liked to finish a couple things, but we also don't want it to go like an hour and a half. So we just had to stop. So Noelle, we're going to start in Acts 23, verse 10 tonight. And why don't you just read like verses 10 and 11?
Let's do it. Acts 23, verse 10. And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome.
Okay, so Paul's ripped out and put back into Fort Antonia. But I think what is really interesting here, and Luke just kind of like drops this in, you can almost skim over it and miss it, is that the very next night, Jesus comes to Paul and encourages him.
Yeah.
Now, you assume that because he needs encouragement, he must not have been on a spiritual high at that moment. Like probably he was pretty discouraged. He was pretty laid out and not doing well, or Jesus wouldn't have found it necessary to go and encourage this man. So I would love to ask you, our Facebook audience, and if you're on YouTube later, you're more than welcome to make the comments there too. But Face Group, why do you think Paul was so discouraged at this moment? And if you can kind of think back to a little bit more of last week, that will kind of help inform your decision as well. Here we have like the super apostle. There's never been anyone like him before or since. He seems like he does everything right. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like even when he barely messes up, he immediately quotes scripture and apologizes for it, which is what he did last week. Like he is the top of the top. And here we see he's so down, he's so discouraged that Jesus himself appears to Paul and gives him some words of encouragement, which we're going to read in just a moment. So looking forward to hearing your answers. Why do you think?
It strikes me that he would have had to be so incredibly discouraged for the actual person of Jesus to show up next to him, because we don't see that happening often. This is a new thing, and it doesn't really happen again. So it strikes me that there's something even maybe special or an extenuating circumstance here to why he's so discouraged that he gets this really special treatment right now. So looking for your comments to come in on Facebook.
Everyone's like, I don't know.
Last week, why would you be discouraged?
Last week we read how when he threw this statement out about the resurrection and they all started going after each other, that a lot of people are like, he was sitting back there going, yeah, now they're all fighting and not me. This is clearly not his MO, because he would have been very encouraged if that had been the case.
Yeah.
All right,
He's
we've got
not
some
energized.
answers coming in.
Yeah, Shireen says he's always doing Christ's work and he's been beaten, and everywhere there's a mob trying to kill him. Maybe he's just incredibly emotionally drained. We are on his third missionary journey and they're all going about the same, which is just not great. So I think that's very reasonable. Susie says maybe he feels he's not making any difference for the Lord. Yeah. And
have you ever felt like that?
Yeah, I like what Kim says. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Very likely. So, Roberta says maybe because no one was listening to him and he's getting put in jail. Yeah, probably. I mean, getting thrown in jail multiple times can't be a great experience. Zara says God had told him to go there, but everything seems to be going wrong. And he wasn't reaching any of the people there, perhaps too, because he identified so much with the Pharisees, his own people.
That's
Margie
a good
said,
insight.
I love Margie. She said having his Jewish identity challenged was really hard for him. And I hadn't thought about that, but that's such a core component of his identity, that to be challenged on that and to be discouraged on that would be really hard. And Becca says maybe he's not seeing the results he'd hoped for after giving it his all. I think those are all great, insightful responses. Anything you'd like to add, Mom?
Yeah, I as I was thinking it through, the only other thing I might add to all of those really great responses is that you remember when Paul got to Jerusalem, he came with this entourage of Gentile church leaders who were bringing a beautiful sacrificial love offering to the church in Jerusalem, because that church was under such persecution and so poor. So he delivered it. When he delivers it, remember that they were like, oh, we got a problem. You're being accused by the Jewish people here of telling other Jews they don't have to follow anything but that Moses did. You don't have to be circumcised, all this stuff. So he ends up having to deal with the elders, and then they make him pay for all these sacrifices. So I think if I were him, like I try to put myself into his place, at this moment, I'm going, where are all those people?
Yeah,
I'm just about getting killed here over and over again. I'm being falsely accused by these people. They're trying to kill me. Now I'm arrested by these Romans. Where are the elders now? Where are the people that we brought all this money of this love offering to? Where are they now? And I think he just felt really abandoned. And there is something extra sad when you, as a believer in Jesus, feel like you've been betrayed or abandoned by your brothers and sisters in Christ. It's never fun to undergo any kind of persecution or trial, but there's something that we can tolerate when it comes from people who are very anti-God. We expect that. We expect that they're going to come up against us. But when it's people that you considered your siblings in Jesus, people that you love, people that you were friends with, is anybody following me? Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah.
Okay. There is,
it's
in
so
my
much
opinion,
worse.
There is nothing more discouraging than that. And there's nothing more confusing than that, because you start to think, what did I do wrong to bring this on myself? It must be my fault, because this can't be for real. And I think that probably somehow, some way played into how Paul was feeling, because the level of discouragement was apparently so astronomical at this point that Jesus felt it necessary to go to him and lift him up and encourage him. So I hope that encourages you to just, for one, to know if it happened to Paul, we're presuming, but I think it's pretty accurate. It can happen to us, and also that Jesus cares. He sees it, he knows it, and he's there for you to encourage you when you start to feel really down about those things.
To Margie's point, I think there's also a component of this was his own people. Being Jewish was such a significant part of his identity.
Yes.
Even leaving the church out of this for a moment, the other Christians, just to have his own people, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish people at large doing this to him had to be so painful. And I'm going to just read verses 12 to 15 for you, because I think you'll see the scope of how much his own people hated him at this point, that certainly I think was contributing to this discouragement. This is verse 12 of Acts chapter 23. It says, when it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you are going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Summarizing, more than 40 men just put themselves under an oath to kill Paul. And I think the literal Greek word for oath here is really interesting. The word used is anathematai, which you might be like, oh, I feel like I know that word. It sounds very familiar to like anathema. Mom, what does this word mean? And what does this tell us about what the Jews, these 40 Jews, are plotting to do right now?
The word anathematai was them taking an oath that basically said, may God curse me if I don't fill in the blank, or if I do fill in the blank. May God kill me. May God condemn me. May he pour his wrath out on me if I fill in the blank. So God does not like when we do things like that. And actually, Jesus addressed this very thing in Matthew 5:37 when he was talking about this, and he said, but let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Anything more than that is from the evil one, meaning Satan. So what Jesus is saying is, you don't need to be calling down curses on yourself from God if you do or don't do something. All I want you to do is be a person of your word. So if you say you're going to do it, then do it. If you say you're not going to do it, then don't do it. But you do not need to bring down curses. And that's what Peter did the third time he denied Jesus. The same word, anathematai, except it has a little prefix on it, which intensifies the word. So like violently called down curses on himself. And that's what he was doing. So they basically asked God to curse them or kill them if they don't murder Paul. Noelle, that just saying that sentence just kind of like blows my mind.
Well, and Margie brings up part of why that's such an insane thing to say. She says, did they just die of starvation? This is a question I always have, because, little spoiler alert, they're actually not going to kill him. So we'll get there in a moment. I had this question too, like, okay, so what are they doing? This is a really strong, like probably the strongest statement you can make. God kill me if, I'm calling down curses upon myself if I don't do this. But this was actually just very, very common practice for people to speak in this hyperbolic language. And so because it was so common and because they were using it so loosely, the rabbis had devised ways around the not eating or drinking part by delineating 4 types of vows that could be broken. This goes back to what Jesus was saying is, have integrity. When you say yes, let your yes mean yes, let your no mean no. Say what you mean what you say, follow through. They're like, no, not that. We will now have a set of rules around what curses and what vows can be broken. So vows of incitement, you can break those. Vows of exaggeration, you can break those. Vows made in error, and vows that cannot be fulfilled by reason of constraint. So basically, any vow could be broken. So this is not that huge. This is not that huge of a deal here because they're not going to starve to death. They could make a case for probably any of those 4 reasons as to why. So it's about a useless thing to say, except to call down a curse from God upon yourself is a very weighty thing. And you remember back in Luke when the people said, let his blood be on our hands and on our children. And this goes very poorly for them. They should have never said something like that. And I like Judy, more rules. Yeah, there are more rules, and there are more rules to get around your rules. So we just keep going in this circle. Regardless, they head off to Ananias, the chief priest, to get his permission to do this. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Sicarii, and they had these little daggers in their cloak. They were called the dagger men. Likely they're planning to carry those little daggers in their cloaks, and they'll stab him to death on his way to the Sanhedrin, make it look sort of like this insurrection, random thing that happened. And their request is completely in line with Ananias's evil character and his desire to just violate the law constantly himself, while also requiring others to keep the law. So that's what's going on here for a moment. Mom, we're about to get into an interesting section. And I think in order to do this, we have to make an interesting distinction between 2 words. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, well, before we read verses 16 to 22, where Paul's nephew actually intervenes and foils a plot to murder Paul, the very plot that was just hatched here, I would love to take just a minute and talk about the difference between two words that we probably don't throw around a whole lot, one more than the other. One is providence, and one is miraculous. So, providence versus miracles. Noelle, talk to us about miracles, because like I said, this is a word that we actually do tend to throw around a little bit. Oh, we're praying for a miracle. God did a miracle
Yeah.
last
Yeah.
week. Is we kind of loosely use that term, but are we using it correctly?
Yeah. So miracles, we see a lot of them in the Bible. And we see Jesus doing a lot of miracles. In the book of Acts, we've seen a lot of cool miracles. And you can identify a miracle because they all have the same set of characteristics and necessarily have those characteristics. So the first characteristic of a miracle is that God has to suspend the natural order of the world to accomplish his will. So this is something that defies all the laws of science and physics, and in any normal course of action cannot occur. And it's really fun, actually, if you want to learn a little bit about miracles in the Bible, to go online and read a bunch of people trying to explain away the miracles of Jesus and the absolute like intellectual backflips they have to do to try to explain how these things are possible, and they can't. And so that's when we say it suspends the natural order. It is outside the realm of what's possible. On top of that, it's obvious. When Jesus turns the water into the wine, people aren't like, this water tastes a little sour. It was like, this is wine. Like, this is so clear what's going on. There is no question as to whether a miracle occurred. There's no question as to what happened. It is so obvious. They're inexplicable in the natural realm. They are rare, so you don't see it happening all the time. If it did, it would rewrite the laws of science and the laws of physics to then be explainable. They're supernatural. And these are two components that I think are super important. One is it's efficacious. We've used this word before, but all this means is that it serves a distinct purpose, that it is not just on whimsy for fun. It's not superfluous or perfunctory. It serves a very specific purpose. It effects some change for some purpose. And then it's observable. So it has to be something that you can actually see, observe, touch, feel, taste in the case of the wine. It can't be, something just kind of happening under the surface that somebody's giving lip service to. You have to actually see the results and the ramifications of it to know that it's real. And we tend to call a lot of things miracles that actually don't meet these criteria. But Mom, give some context for us on what this actually plays out as in our worlds.
Sure. Well, I think that, again, we toss the word around a lot, and we're going to talk about providence here in just a second to kind of compare those and contrast those. But with the miracles, there's a lot of people, for instance, on television that will be, they're healing people, and someone will come up, oh, I've had chronic back pain for years. And then, oh, they put their hands on them. Oh, I'm healed. Well, I can't, how do I know? Like if you got no arm and somebody touches you and you suddenly have a physical flesh and blood arm attached, okay, I buy it. That's a miracle. but this whole like you were saying, under the surface thing is kind of interesting. And I think when we focus a lot on miracles and always looking for God, and I don't want to minimize the fact that God is capable of doing absolutely anything he wants to do. And he does do that. But when that's your sole focus is only looking for miracles, what you are missing around you is God's providence, which is not rare. This is everywhere. I mean, constant. Noelle and I, when we were going over this before we logged on with you guys, we both just said we could sit here for hours off the top of our head with no preparation and tell you story after story after story after story after story of God intervening, but using completely natural means to do it. So let's talk about providence real quick. I don't want to belabor the point, but providence is when God uses just the natural order of things, how he created the world to run in order to accomplish his will. It's subtle. In fact, it's so subtle that people who don't believe in Jesus or God might look at the same circumstance and say, that was just coincidence, that God had nothing to do with that. It was merely coincidental. It's common, it's constant. it uses, like I said, just the normal functions of life. And the examples go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Noelle, just give us, can you give us, pick either a miracle that you've seen, or give us a providential thing that you've seen
Okay.
in real
And
life, in
before
your life?
I do this, I will say this to the point. It could be chalked up to coincidence, right? By those who don't believe. The way that we as Christians know it's not coincidence is because it happens over and over and over and over again as a just standard part of the Christian walk. And this is why when Mom and I were talking about it earlier, like we could go for hours talking about the providence of God in our lives. One of the most incredible for me was that on my third day in Seattle, I walked into a leasing office and met a young man who was a leasing office who leased the apartment for me, who brought me to church, who introduced me to an incredible community of believers. And because of this apartment, because I walked in there, I had a church and I had a community of believers and I had places to serve. And on day 3, living in Seattle as a 19-year-old, I had incredible Christian community that I'd never had before. That is the providence of God. Everything about that was very natural. I went on Google. It was the first thing that popped up for some reason. I walked in. That just happened to be the leasing agent I got, who was a born again believer, who loved evangelism, who happened to ask me the right questions so that I said I was looking for a church. All of those things, kind of coincidence, right? Except that they happen constantly and over and over and over again. And in just sort of the normal vernacular, I might even refer to that as a miracle, because in my life, that was just, it was a miraculous happening. It was wonderful. But it's important to note the difference between it, because if we get really focused in on miracles in the technical sense above, where we're looking for something supernatural or impossible to happen, we miss the things God is doing on the daily, using humans to do, and we don't get to notice and enjoy and just marvel in the constant brilliant work of God in our lives. And I think that's why this distinction is important, because we've seen in the book of Acts God do incredible miracles. And maybe you've even seen some miracles in your life. I was telling Mom a story about my pastor's wife, who had a terrible, terrible, terrible accident when she was 17 and injured herself so badly that the doctor said, you can't have children. You'll never have children, because if you look at this MRI, you can see you cannot have children. And she just gave birth to her 3rd child, which is not possible. And she shouldn't have been able to do that, except every time they were in that delivery room with these children who were born healthy and safe and happy, she could tell them, I shouldn't be able to have this child. And you can go look at my medical records as to why this is not possible. And yet God has provided miraculously. That's a miracle. That's supernatural. That's impossible. That's obvious. And it's efficacious, so that every time they're in that delivery room, they shared the gospel with the doctors and the nurses there. And then similarly, you get the providence of God just over and over again in your life. We're about to see the providence of God in this story. We're about to see God work through people, work through humans to accomplish incredible goals and accomplish his will. Mom, why is it that God generally, especially in the American church, the Christian church today, why is it that we see him work more in providence, more in this day-to-day, almost mundane working than we do in miracles?
I'd love to pose that to the group. So you tell us, because I don't think it's any stretch of imagination to say I see way more providence of God than I see miracles. I don't think there's anyone here who would say it's kind of flipped for me. I see more miracles, but you do. So start commenting. But you do hear of them actually far more on the other side of the globe, especially
Miracles, yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, miracles. In Muslim countries, I often hear of just really inexplicable supernatural things that happen in those regions.
Answering the question though, why do we see more of God's providence than miracles in our lives? Carolyn says that's how he shows us that he loves us. Susie says because God is showing us personally just how close he is to us. Becca says, I think it's so cool that God chooses to use other humans to perform his work in our lives. So
Love
good.
that.
Kim says we have the Bible and church. We don't need the proof of miracles to validate who Christ is, who God is. Wonderful point. Sandy says miracles happen every day. We just need to look for them. Karen says God is revealing himself to us. I love these answers. Let's talk about what Becca said quickly. She says, I think it's so cool that God chooses to use other humans to perform his work in our life. Mom, talk about that, because this is something that we mentioned.
Yeah, well, we were talking beforehand again. that when Jesus left this earth, he gave the Great Commission to people to accomplish. He could have said, these people are losers. I am tired of them and working with them. I can do this so much better myself without them, and just then become all about the miraculous. And I mean, he had every right to do that because he's God and he can do what he wants. But for reasons I will never totally understand, at least not on this side of heaven, for some reason, in his gracious, loving kindness, he lets us in on his plans. He uses us. He doesn't have to do it, but he does. And he uses the natural realm, which in some ways is more miraculous than a miracle if you think about it, like all the moving parts and pieces and all the people in the different places. I'll just tell a really quick story, and then we promise we will get to the scripture and move on. I don't want to belabor it, but it's such a great topic. So one time I was walking into a grocery store, and I'll do this from time to time. I was on the way and I'll say, Lord, if there's anything that you need done in here today, not that I'm capable of it, but if you will help me and you will show me, I'm your girl. So whatever you need done, you just let me know, and I'm gonna make it really clear. Make it clear, because I'm not super bright. So I was at the checkout, and this lady ahead of me was checking out her groceries, and she had an air mattress of all things at the end of her groceries. And when the cashier went to scan it, she said, oh, before you scan that, she said, could you just tell me the price on it? I don't know what the price is. So she did a few things, and I couldn't hear what she said, but I just saw the woman's body language, and she just slumped over and her head went down, so sad. And she said, I don't want it. I don't want it. And right there, I was like, Lord, you want me to buy an air mattress today? Okay, I will. And it was one of those stores where they make you bag your own groceries, so people have to stay a long time afterwards. So I was pretty sure I had a moment. So she went off to bag her groceries, and so when I got to the cashier, I said, before you ring up my groceries, can you tell me how much that air mattress is? And she just looked at me like, what is the deal with the air mattress today? So she's like, okay. So she tells me how much it is. And I, in my heart, I was like, Lord, I will do it. Whatever it is, I will buy it. But please, 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 please don't make it more than $50, because I'm going to have to go home and tell my husband I spent all this money on an air mattress. And I think she said like $15.
Really low.
Are you serious? That's all? And that woman couldn't afford to buy a $15 air mattress. I mean, I almost got her 10. So I said, I'll take it. So she's like, okay, whatever. So she rings up my few groceries. I didn't have too many. And I walked over to the lady who was bagging groceries, and I said, excuse me, I just wanted to give you something. And I handed her the air mattress, and her face was just completely like shocked, blank, didn't know quite what was going on. I said, look, I saw what happened back there. And I just want you to know that even though it's kind of for me, it's really not for me. The God of the universe sees you. He saw you, and he put it in my heart to make sure that you got your air mattress. So it's from him. I just got to be the conduit today. And she burst into tears, threw her arms around me. This is Pennsylvania, where we don't hug on a normal basis. This, not even in COVID, like it's just something doesn't happen, especially between strangers. She hugged and hugged and hugged and cried and got my shoulder all wet. And finally she stood back and she said, I wanted to get this for my mother-in-law. I just got married and we live in this tiny apartment. We don't have a bed for her, and she's coming to visit from Tennessee. She said, I wanted to give her an air mattress to sleep on so she wouldn't have to sleep on the hard floor, but I couldn't afford it. And then she kind of stopped and she said, my mother-in-law is always telling me, I'm praying for you. God is real and I'm praying for you. And then I was like, okay, now I'm going to start crying, because what she doesn't know is I'm pretty sure that her mother-in-law does know Jesus. And she is praying that God would put somebody in her daughter-in-law's path who would share Jesus with her. And I got to do that in this grocery store just a little bit. I invited her to church and I just said, you tell your mother-in-law that her prayers were to some extent answered today. And she goes, okay, I'll tell her. So that's just another example of, it feels like a miracle, but there was nothing suspended about the natural for that whole story to take place. It was just merely providential, God putting me in the right place at the right time and her at the right place at the right time and all the circumstances. And some lady in Tennessee got her prayers partially answered that day. Well, I just think it's awesome. It's someday amazing. In heaven, we can sit around and we can talk for eternity about all the stuff that we remember that God did. Well, maybe we should read the verses now, Noelle. That I've got way too long with this. Okay, 16 to 22. Let's do that.
All right, I love it. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell them." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." This is cool. This is the example of God just arranging all the pieces to accomplish his goal. Nothing supernatural happening here, nothing, outside the realm of the natural order of the universe, nothing physics breaking, nothing science breaking. And yet, talk me through the likelihood that Paul would have an immediate family member that would somehow be in a position that these guys would very clearly and in detail discuss their plan to murder Paul in front of him, that he could get into the right place to tell Paul, that Paul could get him in front of the tribune. I mean, this is the providence of God. This is the sovereignty of God, is that he chooses to use this young man to accomplish his goal of getting Paul to his next destination, of thwarting this plan. And I love that, because we pray for miracles. That's a great thing to pray for, that God would do something supernatural and extraordinary. But I feel like when we get really focused in on the miracles, we can miss the subtle and beautiful ways that God is orchestrating our world and our life every single day. If we're not looking for how we can fulfill prayer requests, how we can be that moving factor in somebody else's life, how we can be the hands and feet of God in a subtle but powerful way, we miss just this huge component of what God does. And I love that this young man was put in just the right place at just the right time. It's so beautiful. God, for whatever reason, chooses to use us to accomplish his will, which I love, because if, to your point, Mom, if he was like, "These guys are a mess, they're incompetent, I don't have time for this, I will just get it done," and he just gets it done. I mean, that takes away a huge aspect of how we know Christ and how we interact with God, if we're not being given opportunities to serve him and to be change makers and to move the world in ways towards his goals. So I love this. In this story,
So good.
God puts this young man in place. Just of interest, Mom. So I always pictured, I mean, the Tribune takes this little boy by the hand and pulls him aside and is like, "What do you have to tell me, sweetie?" And then this kid's like super articulate. And you're like, wow. I mean, good for him. You've got like this 7-year-old who has just really done a nice job of laying out their plan. That's not quite what's going on here, is it?
When we read it with our Western eyes, that's kind of how we read all of these things. So let's just break this down so it makes a little bit more sense. So as a Roman citizen in protective custody, Paul would have had access to visitors. In fact, if prisoners were going to be fed, they were usually fed and clothed by close friends and family members. It was their responsibility to provide. And if they didn't provide, then the prisoner could starve to death. So we're not told specifically, but given that information, it would make sense that Paul's nephew would be bringing Paul some food and maybe a cloak or something like that. So that's why we think he was there. Now, again, we read young boy and we're thinking, a 4-year-old, 5, maybe he was up to 8 years old. I don't know. Do you remember back a few chapters ago, we talked about a little boy named Eutychus who got sleepy in a window and fell out and actually died, and miraculous, Paul, through the power of God, was able to bring him back to life. Okay, so at the time we said that even though it says young boy, in that context of the Greek and in that culture, that would have meant a child probably around maybe as young as adolescence, but probably even into the teen years. So maybe from 11 or 12 up to 15, 16, 17 years old, somewhere in that range. So not a tiny little child. which then begs the question, Noelle, why would the Tribune then hold his hand?
I know,
like
that's the
he's a
part that always
child?
confused me.
That
Because
seems
like,
weird.
yeah, he's like, come here, sweetie. Like, what do you have to tell me? Very Western view of it. Like in our world, the only two times that you hold somebody's hand is if it's a child or if it's your significant other. And so we know this is not his significant other. So we just assume it's a child. This is actually a cultural thing. To this day, men will platonically hold hands with men. Women also hold hands with women
Quite
in
often.
these parts of the world.
Yeah.
And it's not really a it has no like sexual component or there's no weirdness. It's just a cultural thing to really clearly express like affection and closeness and like relational commitment. There was a sociology professor named Samir Khalaf at American University of Beirut in Lebanon. So you can imagine where in the world this is. And he wrote, holding hands is the warmest expression of affection between men. It's a sign of solidarity and kinship. And that's really what's going on here. The Tribune wants to say, hey, I want to hear you. I value you. This is a non-threatening situation. And so that's why he takes him by the hand and pulls him aside. It's not because he's a little boy who shouldn't be out by himself. This is
Right,
this
exactly.
is merely just showing relation.
Yeah, and I think too, like we're just used to a more civilized society, and so you don't feel unsafe in those types of realms. If you're in those, you feel pretty protected. That was not so much the case here. So by taking him by the hand, he wasn't just showing friendliness and some kinship there, but he was also creating a safety net for him, going, I am interested in what you have to say and I will protect you so you can talk to me. And that was kind of all encompassed in that gesture. So anyway, the Tribune believes this boy's story is truthful, and he asked the boy not to say anything about it. So class, Facebook, why do you think that he ordered this boy, this young man, not to tell anybody about what he had just told the Tribune? Tribune. I said it both ways.
I don't know. I'm saying it both ways. I'm probably wrong.
Anxious to hear what you have to say about that, because it seems almost like a strange request. Like, okay, so now we know. What's all the secrecy about? What's the point of being secret about all of this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I also want to just read a couple comments. Bob says holding hands also makes a physical connection to reinforce paying attention to a communication, and I think that's a really good point. Like if you're holding somebody's hands and like listening to them, it's a much more strong statement of like, I'm listening to you. You have 100% my focus and attention. So I assume that's playing a role here too. Zara also notes that men in this area of the world in this time would also cry and express strong emotion more freely and more publicly. These are
still
really
do
important to this day. Yeah. I remember being in part of that world and being like, oh my God, are we all okay? And they're like, oh yeah, everything's fine. This is just like, okay.
Yeah, they're just
Strikes
more
me as there's a
outward
disaster.
Outward expressions of emotion and kinship and friendliness, and even with the double cheek kiss that they will do, whereas we used to just handshake, and that's about as much as we could tolerate. We don't even do that now. I don't know if they're still doing the double kiss over there, if they've decided that's not a good idea right now either. But anyway, so okay, class, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. I'm sure any second now we'll be getting some.
Okay, Bob says because the people had taken an oath to have God harm them if they failed to kill Paul. If word got out, the mob may have lost control and just rushed in to kill Paul anyway. That's a really good hypothesis. Roberta says maybe if others knew what Paul's nephew told this man, then the people who wanted to kill Paul would also kill the Tribune, the commander who had him, which is really interesting.
That's really good.
And Zara just mentions that the Iranians still do 4 kisses back and forth on each cheek, she says, in parentheses, pre-COVID.
LOL.
Zara, I love having your knowledge of that area of the world come in. That's awesome. Mom,
thank you.
Those couple of responses, what's your take on it? Why do you think he told the young boy to keep his mouth shut?
Yeah, for the reasons that you just mentioned, and probably you're all thinking, they have this in their craw that they're going to do this, and if it word gets out that the Tribune knows, they'll just come up with another avenue of trying to make it happen or speed things up. And I thought Roberta's point was well taken, that maybe the Tribune felt like his life was actually a little bit on the line right now too, because they might go after him
Yeah.
to kill him in order to get to Paul. And I hadn't
Yeah.
really even thought about that.
Well, the
So
Tribune's life is very much on the line right now, including
yeah,
for a different reason than that, right?
true. Yeah, talk about that. Yeah.
Well, because Paul was a Roman citizen, it was the responsibility of the Tribune to keep him safe as a prisoner. So, if if these guys did succeed in killing Paul, Paul's dead, that's bad, but the Tribune is going to be in huge trouble. I mean, his career is over, if not his life. He may have been executed for allowing this to happen to one of his prisoners. So he's got significant skin in the game to make sure this does not happen. And I just want to mention, Dottie also said maybe he also has concern for this boy, that his life would be in danger as well. And I think that's very likely as well, that there would be retribution if they knew who had spilled the beans. We love you guys. Thank you for being part of this. This was a fun one. We'll see you back here same time, same place next Monday. And in the meantime, go have an amazing week and go make good decisions, team. And as Zara's saying, don't be weird, team. Good night, guys. Love you.